Hello, everyone. Okay, hello, everyone. My name is Bernd. Welcome to all of you and thank you for joining our CPERN online workshop today. We're still waiting on Yuliya, one of the discussants, but I'll just go on with a bit of the introduction, and then hopefully she'll join by the time we'll get to the input. So yeah, again, welcome everyone. The session today, as you all know, will be about Oleksandr Svitych's book, The Rise of the Capital State and Neo-nationalism, which obviously it's a topic, the whole rise of the far right is something that many of us at CPERN are doing research on, because it's a topic that very crucially requires critical political economic research to uncover questions of, what are the connections between capitalist class relations, power relations, as well as authoritarianism and the state, transformations within the state. So yeah, we're very happy to invite Oleksandr to this and listen to what he's been working on. He's an associate professor of political science at the OP Jindal Global University. And then as discussants, we'll have Yuliya, Yurchenko, and Gareth. And a bit about housekeeping. So we'll first get the input by Oleksandr. Then our two discussants will give their commentary. And then we'll go into a collective Q&A with all of you. And obviously, as you can see, the session's being recorded. So the whole thing will last about an hour, then we'll be finished. And yeah, I think that's all of it. So yeah, with that, the floor is yours, Oleksandr.
Thank you very much, Bernd. Thank you, David, and CPERN organizers and members. I do feel this is the right community to share my ideas. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you all for attending. I would like to share a few slides just to make it more visual for you. Just give me a moment, please. All right. Is it visible?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. Well, let me begin. This talk is based on my book, The Rise of the Capital State and Neo-nationalism in New Polanyian Moment. And in fact, this is the third volume of the Brunel series called Global Populisms, edited by Amy Konechny and Ami Rab. So in fact, the alternative title for today, which I thought about, was The Political Economy of Populism, Perspectives from Karl Polanyi. Because this is actually what I try to do in this project. I try to understand the rise of what is commonly called populism using a theoretical framework from Karl Polanyi. Now, the way I would like to briefly present the book is to summarize it in 5 major themes. And the first theme relates to the terminology. One of the things which I try to do in the book is to problematize the notion of populism. And in my opinion, populism is a misleading term for several reasons. Well, first of all, the populist label, in a way, de-emphasizes the structural conditions which facilitate the rise of anti-establishment parties, challengers, movements, and leaders. Especially when you hear in the media the talk of populism as a threat to democracy, or populism as a symptom of democratic decline. This talk of democracy, as I argue in the book, pushes into the background the structural conditions which facilitate this global phenomenon. Secondly, the populist label does not take into account the ideological differences. Quite common, I see researchers and commentators lumping together different leaders and parties and politicians, ranging from Donald Trump to Bolsonaro to Marine Le Pen to Podemos in Spain, and so on and so forth. So what I try to emphasize is that ideology needs to be taken seriously. And thirdly, the reason why I choose not to use the term populism is because, in my opinion, the key denominator which unites all these divergent movements which try to call for taking control is nationalism. So nationalism is in fact the minimum common denominator. Now, when nationalism is combined with two other things, populism and radicalism, this produces what I call neo-nationalism. Now, I'm not the first one to use this term. Several sociologists like Sarah Valdez, Maureen Egger have actually extensively used and popularized this term. Also, the neo-nationalist concept was developed by several anthropologists. So, but I do see the advantages of using neo-nationalism in comparison to the populist label. Now, when I say that ideology needs to be taken seriously, what I try to show is that we need to make careful nuances. Like I said, between so-called neoliberal populists or lead populists like Donald Trump or Jair Bolsonaro. And then on the other side, we have taken inspiration from Karl Polanyi's social protectionist movements. And here there is another important nuance, because quite often the distinction which appears in the literature is between the left and the right, or the radical left, the radical right, ultra left, ultra right, and so on. What I say and what I show in my research is that the right is in fact not right any longer. So there is a very important subset of so-called right-wing parties, which are actually, and surprisingly and interestingly, left-leaning in their economic policies, in their programs, in their party manifestos, and in their rhetoric. And this subset is represented by the middle line in this table. For example, Front National, which was renamed to National Rally, which is a case study in my book, has a clear, if not complete, but at least left-leaning agenda on economic grounds, calling for regulation of the economy, for social protection, for progressive taxation, and so on. To summarize, ideology needs to be taken seriously when we talk about the so-called phenomenon of populism, because it emphasizes these important nuances. A few empirical illustrations of what I mean by talking about the rise of neo-nationalism. There's also a few important nuances based on my taxonomy. So we have left-wing neo-nationalists, we have right-wing but social protectionists who are actually more left-leaning, but they are still conservative in their social policies. And we have the neoliberal populists who advocate for the same capitalist neoliberal status quo. The second contribution which I make in my project is, of course, drawing on Karl Polanyi's embeddedness theory and his double movement framework. Now, of course, there has been extensive research on Karl Polanyi and how he can be scaled up and applied in our age. And I'm happy that Gareth has kindly agreed to be a discussant. In my opinion, he's one of the best experts on Polanyi. And I would like to preempt an objection. Probably in this project, I don't do justice to Polanyi because I also try to do other things. But still, I take inspiration from his double movement framework, which is in essence a dynamic between market expansion and social protection against the market. Now, when applied to our neoliberal age, his conceptual toolkit can be recalibrated, can be updated, whereas Polanyi talked about economic liberalism and laissez-faire. Today we see the rise of neoliberalism, which has been discussed extensively and theorized in multiple ways. While Polanyi talked about the threats and dangers of market economy, today, to use the phrase of the term of Fred Block and Margaret Summers, we see the domination of market fundamentalism, whereas Polanyi talked about embeddedness and disembeddedness, meaning that economy is always related to society, it cannot be separated, and separating it is a danger in itself. Today we can talk about re-embedding the state on neoliberal grounds, so in essence it's re-regulation of the state. And finally, when Polanyi talks about double movement, I re-articulate his double movement thesis to show that the rise of neo-nationalism is a reaction to the rise of the capital state. And this is the central thesis of my book. And this leads to my third important contribution, the capital state theory. Before I elaborate on this, let me also add a few things. While taking inspiration from Polanyi, I also try to be more creative. I also take inspiration from other literatures, from party politics, from political mobilization, from voters' preferences. So what I try to do through my capital state theory is to develop a multi-layered account of neo-nationalism, meaning that while structural changes in the global economy matter a lot, and I take them seriously, so this is the first structural level. At the same time, we need to understand how these changes are perceived by the people, by voters. Do they feel insecure? Do they feel the threat of social decline? Do they feel leanings for strong leaders, and so on? So perceptions matter. And finally, of course, we also need to take into account the discursive dimension, how exactly populists, so-called populist politicians and parties tap into this demand for protection created by the structural changes in global political economy. So in essence, this is my updated double moment thesis. Whereas in Polanyi's words, it was social protection against market expansion, I try to focus on the interplay between social economic changes, how they are perceived by the people, and how these perceptions are articulated by politicians. Let me skip this and let me say a few words about the third contribution, which is theorizing state transformations. And this is a major part of my book, in one of the chapters. And this is where I developed the concept of the capital state. Now, I use the idea of the capital state in two terms. The first one is a more structural. The capital state is a paradigm of state development where the public interests are shoved into the background and corporate interests prevail. So in a way, it resonates with the Marxist understanding of the state in contrast to the liberal conceptions of the state or mercantilist conceptions of the state. At the same time, I also try not to essentialize the capital state, and my second usage of the term is more sociological or even anthropological. So in fact, the capital state reproduces itself through several mechanisms. So it has this reproductive power. And I try to articulate these mechanisms in terms of what I call intrusion, collusion, and extrusion. So intrusion means responsibilization and privatization, essentially offloading social risk onto individuals. And I measure this through private expenditure on healthcare, education, and housing. Collusion stands for precarious labor, flexible labor, and I measure this through the decline of trade unionism and the rise of and decline of corporate tax. And finally, the exclusion dimension of the capital state represents the transnational aspects of the capital state, and it stands for opening to the global inflows of capital and to global accumulation of wealth and income. So I do engage with several other conceptions which exist in the literature, like competition state by Philip Cherney, transnational state by William Robinson. There are a few others, like embedded state, multi-level governance, but essentially the reason why I developed the conception of the capital state is try to balance the focus of IR literature on international dimension, on global changes, but also the comparative politics literature, which highlights that each nation, that each state has internal dynamics, institutions, and configurations. And here, of course, I talk about the varieties of capitalism literature. I measure the capital state through the capital state index, which is an index of 13 distinct variables. Now, in this table, you can see that as of 2016, the highest capital state index is shown by the United States, followed by the UK. Now, these data are from 2015, and quite interestingly, they predate one of the most important earthquakes, the rise of Donald Trump and Brexit. And using this index, I try to explain in the book why this happened. Now, these are the 4 case studies which I use in my book: Australia, Hungary, France, and South Korea. Now, there is a logic behind using these cases. 2 of them are confirming. So, in essence, there is the rise or fall of the capital state and the simultaneous rise or fall of neo-nationalism. 2 of them are disconfirming. In the case of Australia, there was a huge change in the economy, but the political neo-nationalism was quick to rise, represented by One Nation Party, but also quick to fall. In France, it was the opposite. There was a moderate change in the economy, but there was a huge change in the neo-nationalist vote. And I use the term here, uneven convergence, again, trying to find this sweet spot between IR and comparative politics literature, essentially saying that there are divergent trajectories because each of these states have their unique legacies. In the case of France, it's dirigism. In the case of Korea, it's developmentalist tradition. In the case of Australia, liberalism. And in the case of Hungary, post-socialism. But at the same time, if you look at this graph, there is convergence of the high value of the capital state, meaning in all of these societies, there has been privatization of social risk, precariousness of labor, and the rise of financialization and inequalities. I also do a few quantitative analysis and talking about methods. It's a mixed method study where I employ both quantitative statistical comparative analysis of 36 OECD countries over 35 years. And as I mentioned, also I drill into the case studies as well. Now, this particular graph is quite interesting because this is the 4th contribution of this project. Essentially, it shows that in the debate whether economy or culture matters most, in my opinion, and this is backed by my findings, the 2 are related. So there is interaction between economic insecurity generated by the structural changes in the economy and the need for protection against the other, right? So cultural insecurity, in essence, is driven by economic restructuring. And this graph shows that as the capital state unfolds, people feel more insecure and people vote more for programs which are anti-immigrant. All right, now this is the logic of the case selection. I talked about it. And the final 2 slides represent my findings. Some of them are quantitative, some of them are qualitative. But I would like to conclude by saying that one of the final contributions in this book is trying to understand also the effect of the pandemic on the neo-nationalist phenomenon. And I argue in the final chapter of the book that the pandemic was facilitated by the rise of the capital state. And the reason is because the welfare state and healthcare was hugely endangered by privatization, by again offloading social reproduction capacities onto individuals themselves. So hospitals were underfunded, and also, ironically, those people who felt more insecure, who were on temporary or flexible labor contracts, they found it even harder to make both ends meet during the pandemic. So actually, the pandemic was both the cause and effect of the capital state and neo-nationalist dynamic. And as I conclude in the book, the neo-nationalists whom I discussed in my project, like Marine Le Pen in France, Polanyian in Australia, Viktor Orban in Hungary, and Jobbik in Hungary, and finally progressivist parties in South Korea, they also utilize this COVID-19 momentum to their advantage. Finally, of course, I would like to conclude by saying a truism: in every crisis there is an opportunity, and the pandemic was one of such punctures which highlighted that the capital state transformation has gone too far and we need alternatives. And again, taking inspiration from Polanyian, because the capital state theory draws a lot of his ideas of disembeddedness and commodification and market fundamentalists. So if we continue the logic of Polanyian thinking, then the alternatives would be to recalibrate the state transformation and to make welfare state stronger and more stable, to make labor less precarious and more secure, to increase progressive taxation, and to tackle inequalities. I would like to conclude on this note, and once again, thank you for your attention. And in case anybody would like to read the book, I'm more than happy to share the PDF of the manuscript. Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks a lot, Oleksandr. Yeah, a lot of very insightful stuff there. A lot of things we can discuss, I'm sure. Yeah, for now we'll give the floor over to Gareth for the first comment.
Oh, I'm first, am I? Okay, fine,
Yeah.
fine. Let's go. Thanks. Great. Well, thanks, Oleksandr, for that introduction and for asking me to read the book, which I enjoyed very much, and to Sipern for inviting me to discuss it with you today. It's a very accomplished piece of work. I admired it in so many different ways, not least the mixed methods approach, which I just think Oleksandr applies brilliantly. I mean, it's a model and it's exemplary in how to apply this sort of approach. And Oleksandr has the ability to, be completing regression analysis one moment and then discussing high-level social theory the next moment. I mean, that's a real joy to read a piece of work by someone as adept in both of these very different terrains. I also liked a lot of the substantive points he makes in the book, the critique of other interpretations of populist nationalism, for example, those that focus on culture or on modernization losers. So there's a great deal I liked in the book, but I suppose I've not been invited just to talk about how much I enjoy the book, but to probe a little bit as well, which I'll move on to now. So first of all, the basic framework on capital state and the nation state evolving into the capital state. Well, I think we can all agree there's been a shift in the way in which states operate during the era of neoliberal globalization, essentially. But how does one conceive of this? Largely, it seems to me the difference is essentially states responding to different sorts of pressures as they've evolved since the 1970s. So during the Great Boom in the 60s and early 70s, there were high profits, high tax revenues, and high levels of class struggle. And so what the left hand of the state, as Bourdieu called it, grew in many countries very rapidly, the spending ministries, essentially. And then in the lower growth 1980s and 1990s, with lower levels of class struggle, we saw this ruling class offensive to cut costs. Plus, it was a moment of intensified global competition. And in this era, then the right hand of the state grew. But in your portrayal, you draw the line a little more sharply than I have done just now, Oleksandr, because you say there's a sort of shift in the constitution of states from nation state to capital state. In the past, states were mediators between market and society, and now they've turned into enforcers of the rule of capital, of course, the corporations. Now, what does that mean for understanding states in, say, the time of Karl Polanyi? Or the United States in the age of the robber barons? Were states back then not also enforcers of corporate capital in just the way that you're referring to them today? And on top of that, of course, many states in that earlier period were not really just nation states at all, but they were empires. Now, the nation state, as well, you say, has evolved now into the capital state. and this pairing, it sounds very like Phil Cherney's the welfare state to competition state. What's your difference to Cherney's theory on this? It reads to me as being essentially the same thing, but using different terminology, or have I misunderstood you on that point? Moving to a second central concept, neo-nationalism. There's a central goal of your book is to illuminate the cause of this tendency we've been seeing to neo-nationalism, as you describe it. And then you point out that it can take left-wing and right-wing forms, ethnic and civic, or the other way around. But my question is, why are you focusing only on the right-wing form? You say there's neo-nationalism on the left. You give examples, Syriza, you say, Die Linke, the Scottish Socialist Party, or La France Insoumise. Why only focus on the Front National and not La France Insoumise? Would that not give a different, allow some additional insights? Now, you say neo-nationalism as well is a recent phenomenon driven by what you call the renewed Great Transformation, where the nation state has been reinvented as the capital state. Neo-nationalism, you say, is where nationalism overlaps with populism and with radicalism. But I look back again to history and wonder, how new is this? I mean, on the left, if you think of the communist parties in the 1930s, they were radical, populist, and nationalist. Or on the political right in the 1930s, fascism and Nazism. Then on the question of fascism, you suggest at times that fascism and neo-nationalism have emerged as what you call a Polanyian protective reaction against the capital state. But I'm wondering in what sense fascism is protective. Certainly fascism markets itself as a protective ideology, but how much should we accept those terms? I mean, when is fascism about protection and when is it about sadism? When is a school bully being driven by protective motivation or by a sadistic one? Where to draw that? I would like to hear a little more from you about where those lines get drawn. And still on the question of fascism, you say that Polanyi's discussion in The Great Transformation, he has a blind spot when discussing protective counter-movements because he doesn't discuss fascism under the counter-movement idea. And indeed he doesn't discuss fascism as a counter-movement. He's often interpreted as having done so, but I don't think he does. At least I looked through Great Transformation in preparation for this, and I couldn't find anywhere that he does. Maybe I'm wrong. He does say, however, that fascism was rooted in a market society that was refusing to function. That's the basic thesis of Polanyi on fascism. He sees fascism as ultra-capitalism. In other words, it's part of in his terms, of the movement, not of the counter-movement. And I wonder if you, if you can say why you're trying to broaden his understanding of the counter-movement to include fascism in that way. What does that enable us to understand? Polanyi, of course, would have been a supporter of left-wing populism, but you are not. You're critical of left populism, and I wonder where you and Polanyi disagree on that. And still on the question, I've only got a couple of minor questions left. Still on the question of left populism, I'm wondering why you chose the case studies, Hungary, Australia, France, South Korea. Some interesting comparative work on similar questions that you're looking at has been done, for example, by Danny Roderick, comparing Western European neo-nationalism and left populism in Latin America, arguing that very different sort of shocks, as he describes, associated with globalization, represented grounds on which left populism was more likely to grow in Latin America and right populism more likely in Europe. Why the particular choice of case studies? Why Hungary, Australia, France, and South Korea? They were all very interesting case studies to take, and I learned a lot, but I was wondering why not include somewhere with a more left populist recent record as well. On Hungary, I wondered, Hungary, you used Jobbik as the example of neo-nationalism in that country, and you drew conclusions on that basis from electoral data associated with Jobbik's advances and retreats. But I wonder why not Fidesz? Fidesz is almost equally as neo-nationalist as Jobbik, and sort of right populist in those normally accepted terms. Orban's project is a right populist neo-nationalist one, and yet I think, if I'm right, you exclude Fidesz from this camp but include Jobbik. And I wonder, I'm wondering if some of these, I mean, the quality of the data depends on drawing these lines between categories at times. Final very minor question concerns you. I think you finished the book during the lockdowns, when COVID was upon us, and you introduced some discussion, interestingly, on the COVID crisis. You argue it's a crisis of the capital state that has become dysfunctional, and I think you make that case very well. But I wonder if it's not also originating, at least, in a crisis of a very functional capital state, which is China. I mean, COVID originated in China to do with the very functional forms of, decimating habitat and destroying environments and, environmental depredation and the wildlife trade and so on, which all appear to have been background factors in the origins of COVID. And China, I suppose, is in your terms, is a very functional capital state. And so COVID perhaps emerged from a very functional, successful process of capital state accumulation, so to speak, at least in its origination. I'm not disputing your discussion of the ongoing process of the pandemic and the inability of eviscerated capital states, in your terms, to deal with it effectively. I'm speaking from Britain, which is a case in point, or the United States equally. But great, they're just a few questions I thought I might throw up in case you find, in case they're, to contribute to the discussion. But overall, I learned such a lot from your book, and I'm going to be going back to it for rereading very shortly. So thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Gareth. Really, really insightful comments and questions. Now moving along to Yuliya.
Hi, thank you very much for this wonderful book. I hope there isn't too much echo in here. I was just kicked out of a different room. Thank you again for writing this important book. It's a really rich contribution. I agree with all the compliments that were given by Gareth, Dale. Indeed, a very valuable work in such richness of material, theories, and empirics combined in it. It's something that actually is quite unique in similar type of scholarship, because it's kind of the combination of qualitative and quantitative methods, use of concrete countries and parties as examples rather than engaging in speculative theoretical exercise, is quite unique and rare. It's not very common, actually, in the ivory tower of politics, international relations, and indeed some political economy scholarship. So, in schools, it's very welcome as a book, and I recommend everybody to read it. A quite very needed in the differentiation between different nationalism, because indeed. The narratives of national identity, amongst other, in those political parties and movements, they become quite prevalent, and they get instrumentalized for different purposes. While the terminology assigned to these movements and parties is very often very lazily used, and I'm also getting quite weary of this kind of love inflation and the way that these terminologies are being used by scholars, let alone average commentators. So I think that contribution is really valuable indeed. And the rise of the left, the rise of populism on the right and on the left, and nationalist narratives as well, is also not, it's a very serious problem right now, and it requires a meticulous analysis, because the left is losing the dispossessed minds and movements to the right. And the right are very instrumental in their ability to accept that culture and identity matter for the workers, and they know how, but they also, we as those who I consider here all on the left, have to understand that people clinging into their identities in their various forms does not automatically make them fascist, and the inability on the left to understand that, especially in the era of increasing capitalist accumulation and dispossession and forced alienation, is something that the inability to deal with that on the left is also what gives a lot of prevalence to the right. So again, in the world of excessive dispossession and empowerment of transnationalizing capital and excessive mobility of that capital, combined with increasing restrictions on selected forced movements on labor, the constriction of basic choices that labor have and their forced alienation, is that identity is one of the few things that is left for them to cling on and fight for. And that needs to be appreciated if we are to build progressive politics. That is, you know, whether we want to talk about left populism or not, it's, you know, we can discuss this later, but overall there needs to be a reckoning with that on the left, that it's not just class identity that matters to people, there are other forms that are equally important. So, excuse me a second. I have interlopers here. So, so that's kind of you. I could talk about the importance of your work for quite longer, but I'm also wary of time, and I want to kind of I want to push you on a couple of other things. So, I'd like to make a comment that's a bit of a provocation. Is what we're observing really a double movement, or is it a dialectic? Because a process where numerous social forces, structures, institutions, cultures, religious values, common interests are interpenetrated and are in constant ongoing interaction with ensuing shifts of boundaries, agencies, and spaces for maneuver where those agencies can be exercised, with the result of new institutional and structural constellations, and also associated language of movements. It all happens in a multi-directional manner. There are shifts back and forth in all sorts of directions. And in that sense, with all my respect to the work of Karl Polanyi, I think talking about a double movement is somewhat of a simplification of the complexity of the processes that we see before us, especially, and Gareth already appealed to that, we're looking at this kind of post-1970s transformation of the world economy, where we see increasing transnationalization of accumulation, and with that, transformation of the class structure of labor internationally as well, transformation of institutions and transformation of state as an institution. There are different, like states do not necessarily serve their national capital as much as they serve the transnationalizing fractions of the capital that is part of them. At the same time, they're equally becoming less autonomous, some depending on the state, depending on the type of industry and the historical moment in time. States are losing their degrees of autonomy to the agents of institutional change. And you appeal to historical institutionalism. And I think to that end, like, you know, it also has its analytical limitations, especially when we talk about states that are subject to disciplining by IMF restructuring, for example, or indeed economic crisis through other such as constellations in their own institutions. Indeed, the selection of countries that you bring in are quite different in kind of their degree of integration in the financial structure, in the structures of financialized capital, in different kind of access or lack of to different integration to different trade blocks, the kind of soft power, Hungary altogether has a kind of semi-post-Soviet experience. South Korea was allowed to have a strong state to not let communism spread. So those kind of unique constellations are quite significant, right? So, and they are not always necessarily part of the incremental, endogenous change in the countries, but rather sometimes actually forced externally. So that kind of porousness of nation state as institution and state itself as a group of institutions and administrative unit is something that I find could be, is the historical institutionalism somehow does not quite go far enough to allow us to encapsulate that complexity of those different constellations on the units of state that emerge, and therefore compromise the ability to write kind of a neat typology of these different states that variety of capitalist literature likes so much. And to that end, and I'm going to try to wrap up here because there is just so much in the book that we could talk here till Christmas. But you use work of Robert Cox and Stephen Gill and Maxwell, who are kind of the fundamental text in Gramscian scholarship, and there is appeal to Polanyian as well. And in IPE literature, there is loads of text besides Cherny, for example, who talk about the transformation of, who take kind of more class-based analysis to understanding how the nation state as an institution itself has been transformed and how it crystallizes. This is a Polanyian stuff, and you know, I've developed that in my work, for example, of Polanyian and Cox, the understanding that, because like Cox also talks in his 1981 article that the nation state is not a useful unit of analysis, state society complexes are. And then if we look at kind of where capital fits in all of this, then we start getting a slightly better understanding of kind of why certain states conduct politics that, and their governments conduct politics that sometimes are counterintuitive to that kind of capitalist state national interest, right? Because the states are not as kind of uniform as we want them to be. And so that kind of porousness and complexity, I think it would be, like there are some other literatures that are kind of slightly better at dealing with that. I think I'm going to stop at that because there is already too much that has been given to you, and we're kind of quickly running out of time, and other people must have comments. And Gareth already made excellent suggestions, lots of them for you to comment on. So I'm just going to stop at that, and thank you for writing this really extensive work. I can, you know, as an author myself, I can see that there was a lot of labor that went into it, and thank you so much for it. And I look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Yuliya. And yeah, now for the next for the rest of the session, let's go into the Q&A. So if you have questions to Oleksandr, if you have comments on what you've heard, just raise your hand here in Zoom, and we'll get into it.
Is it possible that I respond, or let me put it this way, try to chart out the contours of my responses to the comments by Gareth and Yuliya first?
Sure, I'm also not seeing any hands up right now, so yeah, sure, go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, both Gareth and Yuliya, for your kind words, and I learn a lot as well from your comments, and I also follow your work, and I think you made me a lot of food for thought. And definitely, I will not be able to process everything right now. But just to quickly, at least to try to think aloud to some of the key points which both Gareth and Yuliya made. Regarding the idea of the competition state, and I think this is where both Gareth and Yuliya hit the common point. Indeed, I try to move away from this emphasis on the international or the global level. And I think this is my key difference with Philip Cherny's competition state thesis. I have also extensively followed his work. I have communicated with him. I also love what he does. My emphasis, though, is a bit different. At least from my perspective, the competition state thesis really emphasizes the international level and the international developments, which are, of course, very important. like the rise of international trade, information technology, the rise of global supply chains, and the rise of precarious labor, the rise of these international institutions. So these are developments which, of course, exert pressure, also as Yuliya pointed out, and there are key agents which exert pressure, like the IMF, WTO, and others. What I try to do instead, I try to refocus the attention a bit at the national level, because I still feel that nations, governments still have the agency. These important global developments and the pressures from them notwithstanding, it is the states who decide whether to pursue certain policies, whether to give in to pressures of financialization or privatization, deregulating industries. So in this way, I think the state is still an important player and an anchor at the same of all these important global developments. So this is my key difference. I think I try to avoid the determinism of the competition state, if I can put it this way, while of course taking into account the importance of these international and exogenous factors. And by the way, I also try to incorporate the influence of these factors through the dimension of the capitalist state, which I call extrusion, because this is precisely the transnational dimension. The way I operationalize it is through an openness to global capital flows, through concentration of income. So in this way, I try to acknowledge the transnational aspects, which is part of the competition state thesis. Also, Gareth,
by the way, we have a raised hand now, so would you be happy with that one?
Yeah, definitely.
Owen, go ahead.
Can you hear me? This hasn't been working very well, so can you hear me?
You're loud and clear.
Okay. So I'd just like to go back a little bit, partly to Gareth mentioned it before, to just discuss something, or to try and get you to broaden a little bit on your take on the counter movement in particular, and how you present that. So I mean, Great Transformation is a bit of a bizarre book in the sense that certainly in today's market, if you like, 31 chapters, 32 chapters, and a lot of them disjointed, not entirely connected on together. But one of the things that is, I think I wrote something on this about 10 years ago, which I find quite apparent, is that there's not actually that huge amount there on the counter movement. That's possibly why the counter movement has been used in so many different ways, as Gareth pointed out in his intro to Polanyian about 10 years ago, with his how many counter movements, or no end of counter movements. But one of the things I was sort of like probing, and it's repeating some of the things about the 19th century to the present day, is when he was using it, it was, and you can make an argument, as Robert Cox and a lot of world order people do, which you don't really use. You use a huge amount of IPE text here, looking at, and I've only managed to really look at the index and the intro. But there was a lot in Cox's Power, Production and World Order, where he looked at sort of Polanyi, the counter movement at a global level, possibly not particularly wisely, but to sort of look at a sort of return of protectionism. But anyway, more specifically, the only real example he gives is when he talks about the counter move per se is of 19th century England at the time, or 19th century Britain, which had specific things, and it had, obviously it was coming out of the great era of Parliament between 1832 and 1867, of the era, if you like, of the self-regulated market. And it was here in particular where things like universal suffrage came in, and it was trying to deal with that led facing the counter movement across. So my point is, if you like, the neoliberal form of capital has dealt to a certain degree with democracy and with suffrage, to a degree, at least formally. So how can you apply, or is it potentially possible to apply this type of understanding the way you do to these diverse case studies? And how do you get round to do that? That's my main question. The other thing is I'd like to look at the book more generally, because I've only just managed to, flip through the intro to really see how it's placed. Well, that's the other question I've got is, do you see this more of as a comparative study or something else which contributes more widely to, say, critical political economy or critical IPE, which is slightly different again?
Great. Thanks a lot, Owen. David, you have your hand up. Do mind the time a little bit, and maybe we kind of have to reflect on this 1 hour duration, if that's actually the best way to go about this. But yes, go ahead.
I'll be very quick. Yeah, thanks. No, thanks for all the discussion, and it's really interesting. And thanks for the book. And I'll be looking forward to reading about it. It was really just a question. The thought that came to my mind was when you were talking about how do we challenge this, or how do we prevent the sort of rise of neo-nationalism, and you talked about the expansion of the welfare state and so on as a kind of as the alternative that would prevent it. But I suppose my concern was, well, what if that's not happening, which it doesn't seem to be, and I can't see many opportunities globally where the welfare state is being expanded. So if that's the case, are we just stuck with more and more far-right growth? I suppose that's my concern. Or is there some other way that we can avoid that, or is it just, that's basically my question.
Very simple final question to kick to you, Oleksandr. So yeah, go ahead. Obviously, you don't need to answer literally everything, but also some responses.
Let me try to reply to David's and Owen's questions. And I'm sorry to not give complete feedback to Gareth and Yuliya's comments. Owen had two questions. The first one, can I really imply this idea of counter movement to the period of neoliberal globalization, taken into account that Polanyi applied it in a particular sense, and Owen mentioned specifically the rise of universal suffrage? I think that applying Polanyi's framework in his original sense is not entirely possible. At the same time, I would like to also mention that there were many other examples of counter movements which Polanyi mentions in his work. Now, the universal suffrage is one. He also talks actually quite a bit about state legislation. And for him, the whole fundamental departure point of this transformation was the anti-poor law in 1834. So state plays a huge role in disembedding economy, in providing the rules and institutional framework for the market to operate. Actually, he also talks about other things which are quite interesting, in my opinion, things like Owenism, which is maybe the precursor to modern trade unionism. And he dedicates quite a lot of time to Robert Owen, and in a way how his ideas of how his communists try to re-embed society. So he also, of course, talked about things like gift economy. So I'm not sure that universal suffrage is the only example, but if we look at his main conceptual toolkit, in fact, I think it is quite striking how the analysis which he conducted, of course, for a specific historical period of the rise of the industrial Britain is quite similar to the latest neoliberal globalization period. Now, of course, we can argue whether this application or scaling up of Polanyian's framework is justified. In my opinion, yes, it is justified, but with several modifications. And the modifications which I do make in the book is focusing on a few other things in addition to state power. So also there is a quick question, or there is a quick response to your second question on, I primarily see this book as a contribution to the critical political economy. And I explicitly state this in the introduction and also in the conclusion. In fact, I also am inspired by Robert Cox as one of the founders of the CPE and the whole idea that we need to demystify relations of power. This is exactly, I avoid the term populism because it mystifies its relations of power. This is exactly why I try to understand how the state has transformed. So yes, this is a contribution primarily to critical political economy. And of course, Polanyian framework is not the only way to do CPE. There are many other ways. Gramsci, of course, which Yuliya does, for example, Foucault, which I'm lately am inspired by, Frankfurt School, but there are many, many others. And secondly, this is a comparative study. But if I'm to rank CPE first, comparative politics second. Regarding David's question on if we do not see the expansion of the welfare state, then how we can avoid this neo-nationalist conundrum, right? So what can we do? Expansion or strengthening of the welfare state is one of the solutions. Again, if we try to follow the logic of Polanyian thinking and apply his idea of disembeddedness and commodification, his idea of fictitious commodities when everything is for sale, land, labor, and money. Actually, these three dimensions of the capital state which I developed, they represent these three types of commodification. Commodification of social reproduction, when education, healthcare, and housing becomes individualized, private. Commodification of labor, when there is the rise of precarious labor, informal temporary conflicts, and commodification of money, which is the last dimension of the capital state, which I express as financialization, essentially. So all these three mechanisms need to be reversed. And welfare is only the first mechanism, what I call in the book intrusion. So there are multiple ways to tackle this, in other words. But also, I think, on a more radical note, if I may add, and I think the pandemic especially highlighted this extremely well, there are other proposals which tap into this logic of decommodification. The proposal I'm particularly intrigued by is the universal basic income, which has been much talked about, and not only talked about in academic circles, but also there have been many pilot studies, including here in India, where I'm based currently. And now, of course, this is a tricky question because UBI has been used by everyone on all dimensions of the political spectrum, by neoliberals, by left-leaning intellectuals. So, but it does have this potential of decommodifying labor because essentially UBI allows you to exit, if you want, from the labor market at your own choice. You're not forced to. So this is one of the proposals which just came to my mind. I would like to stop here, and I hope I made justice to your questions, and thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Oleksandr. Thanks a lot to our two discussants. Thanks a lot to all the questions that were asked. Yeah, really sorry, Angela. It's like you just joined us as we're wrapping up, but it's nice to see you in any case. And let me use this final minute to just quickly plug our next online workshop that we'll be having next month. So I'll just put a link to that one in the chat. So it'll be 1 month from now, 29th of June, again Thursday, this time 5 p.m. UK time, 6 p.m. Central European time, about Thomas Haynes Doran's new book, Derailed, How to Fix Britain's Broken Railways. So that promises to be interesting. Yeah, with David and Andrea Block being our two discussants. So yeah, hopefully see you then. And yeah, again, thanks a lot, everyone, and yeah, have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you all. It was great. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for writing the book again, Oleksandr. It was illuminating. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, and special thanks to Yuliya and Gareth for your time and food for thought. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.